when you look at the ancient Republic of Rome, it was very successful. It was successful for hundreds of years. And the Romans were the most aristocratic race in all of human history, as Nietzsche said. And their sort of general attitude towards the way to conduct themselves was to go out and wage war and conquer the Untermensch around them, and then take slaves and bring the slaves in. This is how you're supposed to conduct yourself as an elite. You're supposed to be it's war and leisure, as they used to say. The Roman elite were doing this for a while, and eventually they got so good at it that they started to form essentially like a slave caste underneath them. And this became a very big problem because you had in Rome a native class. So you had the sort of native Romans, and then you had the upper elite Romans, who would have been, you could say, the exceptional Romans. And that would have been literally a nation, like an actual race united as a tribe. And the political leaders would go out and bring all these native Romans as legions. But then what began to happen over the centuries is that these incredible legions bring back slaves, and these slaves end up doing jobs for the very elite. And then the kind of middle bulk of native Romans start to actually have problems because of this. So, for example, these slaves would work on the farms. Now, this actually cheapens the labor pool. And so the native Romans start to, not be able to make as much money, or their wages go down. And then on top of this, stuff like the accumulation of wealth starts to rise up into the political caste. And then a lot of different problems begin to happen as a consequence of this, because in order for you to work in the Senate, you didn't get paid money to be a Roman politician. You had to have wealth. All the guys at the top started to gather more wealth and become the politically influenced, and they obviously began to construct the republic to suit them more and more and more. And then the native class begin to get, basically the kind of middle class begin to get squeezed out. There's no labor. They're competing with literal slaves who work for free because they'll get their balls cut off otherwise. And then they're competing against an elite who have these giant pools of slave labor and are starting to buy up all the land. Worse again, in order for them to compete, they need money, obviously. So they start getting loans off this political elite. This political elite give them loans, but they use high interest rates, usury, as we know it formally. And this begins to rinse them. And the guy Brutus, who killed Caesar, or participated in the plot, he was charging interest at 400% in a Greek island of Crete. Nowadays, it'd be a big deal if interest rates go up from like 5% to 6%. Back then, it was 400%. It's insane. Like, it's just pure exploitation. It had to get banned by the Catholic Church and the Muslims to do interest rates that much, because it's so weaponized when people use it this way. So all of these trends were in place in Rome, where essentially the elite, the top, the optimates, meaning optimal, the best, I guess you could say they were betraying the middle class, if you want, the native Romans. And Caesar represented this sort of countervailing force. Now, this is a very interesting countervailing elite force, because he's almost like a left-winger, if you think about it, or a Democrat. They call it a populist, whereas where we get the word populism from. And his family were like a faction of the elite that thought that if the elite exploit the middle class too much, because slaves they didn't give a fuck about, they're like, yeah, whatever, they're slaves. But if they exploit the middle class, the populace, the plebs, too much, it causes inequality imbalance. Now, this is actually something that's been well studied now, and people have realized it's actually like massively socially destabilizing. So it's actually in the interest of the elites to be more, I guess you could say, left-wing or egalitarian, because it stabilizes the society. The more the elites create a hierarchy that favors them, the more it destabilizes things. So Caesar and all them, his family, were like supporting this. They were saying, look, we need to actually have the balance of power in place here. We need to make sure that we're doling out charity, or we're just making things more fair to them. A big kind of talking point was land reforms, literally taking land off the political elite, ending usury, ending interest, balance things out. And the second one was giving back land. It's almost like the student debt thing, that you hear Biden talk about. Now, what's fascinating is that there was a kind of run-up movement to do this. And the first kind of political force that came out of essentially the left back then, they were called the Gracchis. They were actually billionaires. Now, I say this is what Trump is like. They were a set of really wealthy merchant billionaires who kind of stood up, almost like businessmen, and said, listen, guys, this system isn't going to work the way it's going. So I think we should do some reforms and balance the power levels here and give the natives something. Like land reforms was the big thing. Political elites were like, these guys are going to win, so they killed them. They assassinated them. That was a big mask off moment, because then all of a sudden the populace said, holy, these aren't going to do what's right. They're not going to do what's fair. These guys, and the optimates, are very Nietzschean. They're like, why should we give the plebs anything? There are Untermensch then. And so what happened is Marius stands up. Marius is now much more aggressive. He's like a sort of military man, and he fights against the optimates. And the figure he fights against is Sulla, who's like one of the biggest badass mafia bosses you come across in all of history. And these two guys fight each other. So if Trump is Gracchi, this is the sort of idea, is that what comes next now is going to be actual political war, political violence, political civil war. And this is just going to be like levels above what we're going through right now. Caesar is the nephew of Marius. So it's kind of like Trump is Caesar, but it's more like Trump might be the sort of canary in the coal mine for this massive imbalance where the native class are feeling, the MAGA class feel like they're getting screwed. And this is only starting a process now that's going to lead to more and more polarization, eventually serious political violence, possibly civil war. And then out of that rises a military man who begins to promise everyone saying, hey guys, I'll save you. And there's a lot we can go into here, again, from classical philosophy. The problem of the tyrant, because eventually a strong enough figure can show up and realizes he can gain consent off the masses by promising them debt jubilee and basically left-wing politics if you want, although it's not a fair way to frame it. But I'm basically saying to them, I'll save you from the elites. And then he gains like Caesar-level power. So that's kind of the prediction, if you will.
Well, so I think there's sort of ways that it is parallel, ways that it's not. On the economics question, the reason that like slave labor increased income inequality for like wage labor is because slaves, unlike immigrants, which you're making sort of the modern analogy, they don't get to spend any money that they make. They both undermine the wages of other people, but they're not increasing demand for things, which would raise the wages of other people. It's all being funneled into the pockets of like the elites that own them. So essentially they're functioning almost as capital rather than as labor. So in a modern day economy, like immigration neither increases nor decreases wages through like labor supply and demand effects, because like, again, immigrants come, they make money, and then they also buy stuff, which increases demand for other wages. There are effects about productivity because they're complementary labor and on entrepreneurship. That said, I do think that there are other economic conditions like long-running income inequality in the United States, high inflation recently, that I think have caused like a lot of discontent. But I also do think there's something, I don't know, a little bit strange in that, like, even if, the economy is good now or not, this is like a contentious thing, and I know a lot of people disagree. But if you look at any of the metrics we have for the economy and then look at like previous periods of time, there have been many other times in US history where things have been objectively a lot worse and people were a lot less mad about it. And so there's something about this unique moment where maybe it is because like inflation is something that's particularly infuriating, or maybe it's just like the images or the sense of like a chaotic border is making people feel under assault. We have a perfectly optimized digital media ecosystem that, because people respond to like negativity and negativity goes viral, really constantly funnels like information that's like things are really, really horrible. Bottom line though is I think the sentiments are very similar in that people do feel across the board politically very cynical, very jaded, things aren't working, and that creates an opening for people to offer a chance to shake it up.
I can just tell you the historical analogies, and I think it's like almost like first principles. You should probably start from the idea that when slave labor comes in, it does tend to actually be a relationship between an elite and an underclass. Like, this is something you see almost consistently throughout history. Haiti is a brilliant example. The French take in loads of slaves, and Jesus, did they take in a lot of slaves. And that just essentially led to a necessarily unstable civilization that toppled Haiti. The Dominican Republic, literally on the same island, took in like a significantly less amount of slaves because the Spanish had a taboo against slavery from the very beginning of colonialism. And that's one of the wealthiest Latin American countries in like all of the world. And it's fascinating to see the legacy of these types of things. Obviously, the Black Americans in the USA are the same example. So we look at what's going on at the moment, and like, would you say these immigrants coming in are slaves? It's clearly an attempt for the elite to bring in people who are cheap labor, 100%. Now, maybe there's a way that they figured out modern economics to make that work and not cause problems, and I don't understand it. That could definitely be true. But I would just look at the sort of unconscious rumblings that you're seeing, which is that temperature is obviously going up, and we can say, oh no, don't worry, the system's working fine. But it's like, look, I don't know. I'm looking back at history. The temperature's rising up. People are feeling screwed. It could be social media radicalizing them. I'm actually quite open to that it's maybe not as bad as people say, and people are just getting radicalized for some reason. But generally speaking, I think it's wise, shall I say, to ground ourselves and say, well, listen, this is how these trends tend to unfold. In Caesar's time, this exact same first principle pattern was happening. Cheap foreign slaves coming in. The slaves, by the way, weren't just like reduced to chattel slavery. They were actually able to make their own money. They were able to eventually become free, often within a lifetime. Happened to quite a lot of them. And that still had the effect of flooding Rome with native slaves. So this is actually another big problem, is that the free men often would do better sometimes than the natives, because the political elite would give them, they would like leave them land sometimes, or give them more money. They give them like an inheritance because that was their personal slave.
And eventually they'd become citizens too. Like, there was this expansion of the Roman Empire when those those who were living in the new provinces ended up becoming Roman citizens. Would you say something like that also contributed to the eventual decline of the Roman Empire? It's like that quote from The Incredibles, like, if everybody's super, nobody's super.
This gets a little bit ruthless, so I don't want to be too rude or anything like this, but I think what happened when Caesar came is he tried to reform the Roman Republic. Weirdly, he tried to do something that made it a little bit more egalitarian and actually tried to take power off the elite and make it a sort of a more equal society, almost like liberalized it in a weird way. And then that itself started to set up another problem. Rome started to become an awful lot more open because all empires have to be like this, you know? The USA was clearly founded on the principles of, like, you know, the founding stock was Anglo-white people and they could barely take in Irish people, you know? After it became hegemon, it had to shift to the concept of, like, we take in everybody. That's the necessary principle that has to happen for an empire. And so once Rome started to go that direction, all sorts of same incentives, this stuff is very complicated, incentives push them this way. Caracalla needs a bigger army to fight big wars, and so he liberalizes citizenship, you know, and then it eventually comes to a point where towards the end of the Roman Empire, 50% of most cities were essentially slaves. And that's not even the count of people who were ancestors of slaves, like active 50%, which is just enormous at that point. And I often put forward the idea that Christianity came out of this. You have a load of people from the Middle East come into Rome, and that's in the genetics. And Christianity was actually almost like a very, very maybe rude, but communist revolution against the sort of old Roman establishment that was basically not even there at that point. And like, a lot of these trends are very fascinating things. When they take out over the course of centuries, they become even more crazy. So yeah, it's an interesting way to think.